Ellis, Texas, with its quiet streets winding past modest homes and neat white picket fences, seemed like a perfect picture of small-town America. A place where time slowed down, where people called each other by their first names, and where doors were often left unlocked on hot summer nights. It was a faith-based community where tragedy only happened on television screens and only visited the small town on news feeds from distant cities. But the night of January 2nd, 2018 changed that idyllic picture forever. Gunshots rang out in the darkness, tearing apart the silence of Ellis, and also tearing apart the naive faith and safety that the community had taken for granted for so long. It was 2 a.m. when the panic call came in to 911. The woman on the phone, her voice shaking and sobbing, was Sandra Garner, 55, who had just found her husband, John Garner, 42, lying motionless on their bed, blood soaking the pale blue sheets. Through sobs, Sandra described how a mysterious intruder, a man dressed in black and wearing a ski mask, had snuck into their home and shot her husband while they slept. The first police officer to arrive on the scene, Bradley Elliott, witnessed a scene straight out of a horror movie. In the dimly lit bedroom, blood was still flowing from John Garner's body, forming a dark red pool on the sheets. 2 bullets had ended his life, one in the chest and one in the head, the second clearly the fatal shot. His face was frozen in shock, as if death had come too suddenly for him to realize what was happening. In the corner of the room, huddled in her pale pink nightgown, Sandra Garner was shaking uncontrollably. Her face was pale, her eyes bloodshot from crying, and her whole body seemed to be convulsing in shock. When Officer Elliott approached, Sandra rushed toward him, like a sinking ship seeking safety. She told how she had awoken to the sound of gunfire, only to find an armed man standing over her bed. The intruder, Sandra said, had said he had no intention of harming her, only to kill John because John had ruined his life. The intruder then forced her face down and counted to 100 before leaving. He also took $18,000 in cash from the bedside safe and warned her not to call the police until he was gone. Sandra's story seemed clear and convincing, a tragic break-in that led to murder. No one would suspect a devastated widow recounting the horrific moments she witnessed her husband's murder. No one, except experienced police officers who had seen too much, would believe such a simple story. Because as the first rays of dawn filtered through the blinds onto the crime scene, they also illuminated the first details of Sandra's story that didn't add up. And in the days, weeks, and months that followed, what initially seemed like a straightforward case would turn into a complex maze of lies, conflicting clues, and dark mysteries that might never be fully solved. As the investigation began, investigators patiently sifted through the details of Sandra's story. From the very beginning, a series of thorny details emerged, pieces that didn't fit into the picture Sandra described. The first and most important phenomenon that raised suspicions: there was no sign of forced entry into the house. No broken windows, no broken lock, no signs of disturbance outside the master bedroom. The house was equipped with a state-of-the-art security system, but it had not been activated that fateful night, although Sandra insisted that they always turned on the alarm before going to bed. Detective Sears, one of the first to arrive on the scene, could not help but note that in most break-ins, there would be signs of a struggle or traces of a hasty search. But at the Garner home, everything seemed too neat, too organized to be a typical break-in. There were no ransacked drawers, no other valuables missing, and no muddy footprints or marks left by the intruder. Further questions arose as investigators interviewed neighbors. No one in the quiet neighborhood had heard the gunshots echoing through the night, even though 2 shots had been fired just a few houses away. No one had seen any strange vehicles or suspicious figures moving in the area at the time Sandra estimated the intruder had left, and no one saw a man in black running from the Garner house as Sandra described. But the most disturbing detail in Sandra's story lies in the mysterious intruder's alleged motive. According to her account, the killer claimed that John had ruined his life. Yet John Garner was a simple, straightforward man, a factory manager known for his fair character and respected by his co-workers. He had no known enemies, no significant conflicts with anyone, and seemingly no reason to be the target of such a targeted assassination. Sheriff Boyd Norton, a large man with a receding hairline and often tired eyes, was forthright in his suspicions. If John Garner had truly ruined someone's life to the point that that person would want to kill him, there would surely be traces of that feud in John's life, some clue as to who could have hated him so much. But so far, the investigation has failed to turn up anyone who fits that description. As the investigation progressed, Sandra was taken to the police station for a formal statement. There, in a cold interrogation room with harsh fluorescent lights, investigators began to notice Sandra's atypical reactions. While there were moments when she seemed to be in extreme distress, there were also moments when she showed surprising control, even pausing to correct small details in her story. This inconsistency in her emotional response raised the first red flags in the minds of investigators. When asked about their marriage, Sandra described a nearly perfect relationship with no conflict, almost no disagreements. She and John had been married for nearly 7 years, Sandra's third marriage. They met at the factory where John worked, where Sandra had also worked before resigning to become a housewife. According to Sandra, John was the ideal husband any woman could dream of, and she could not understand why anyone would want to harm him. However, as investigators dug deeper into the couple's history, cracks began to appear in this picture of marital bliss. John had taken out a $2.5 million life insurance policy just 18 months before his death, with Sandra as the sole beneficiary. John's co-workers revealed that he had recently expressed dissatisfaction with his marriage, even mentioning the possibility of divorce in private conversations. Additionally, Sandra was no stranger to tragic loss. Her second husband, Ron Hoover, had also died under unusual circumstances, an electric shock while doing repairs in a hot tub. Although the death was ruled an accident, the remarkable coincidence of Sandra losing 2 husbands in unusual circumstances raised uncomfortable questions in the minds of investigators. After 2 days of lengthy questioning, Sandra was allowed to return home, but the police's suspicions could no longer be hidden. They had a clear suspect in mind, and they would not stop until they had the evidence they needed to solve this case once and for all. As the 4th day after John Garner's death arrived, investigators obtained a warrant to search Garner's home and vehicles again, this time focusing specifically on finding any electronic devices that might reveal more information about what happened that fateful night. What they discovered far exceeded their expectations, opening a startling new chapter in the investigation. On a tablet belonging to Sandra, investigators discovered a shocking internet search history. Just days before John's death, someone had searched for disturbing terms: how to kill your husband without getting caught, how to fake a break-in, information about the firing ability of a .38 pistol, and whether anesthetics can be detected in an autopsy. A string of searches that can only be described as premeditated research for a planned murder. Detective Rodriguez, with 15 years of experience investigating violent crimes, immediately realized that these searches were not the sign of an impulsive act. They were evidence of a well-planned plot, a carefully researched plan to eliminate John Garner once and for all. But the most significant discovery came from a search of Sandra's Ford Mustang. Clumsily concealed in a paper bag under the passenger seat, investigators found a distinctive Taurus .38 special pistol, the exact type of weapon that had ended John Garner's life. Ballistics tests quickly confirmed that this was the murder weapon, the one that fired the bullets found in John's body. The gun had been wrapped in a handkerchief in a clumsy attempt to prevent fingerprints from being found. But what was truly remarkable and puzzling was that the killer had kept the murder weapon rather than dumping it in some remote location, a basic mistake that even amateur killers rarely make. The next day, armed with this new evidence, officers went to Sandra Garner's home. In a scene that neighbors would talk about for years to come, Sandra Garner, a grieving widow, was handcuffed and escorted into a waiting patrol car. As she was led away from the house where her husband had been murdered just days earlier, Sandra's face no longer showed the grief of a widow, but the shock and bewilderment of someone who had just seen her perfect plan fall apart. Sandra Garner was arrested and charged with first-degree murder in her husband's death. With the murder weapon in her car and a suspicious internet search history, the police believed they had cracked the perfect case and brought justice to John Garner. With the murder weapon, the internet search history, and a story riddled with suspicious details, prosecutors felt they had a solid case against Sandra Garner. To them, the case was as clear as day. A disgruntled wife plotted to kill her husband for a large insurance payout, creating a fake break-in to throw the police off guard. But as preparations for trial began, cracks began to appear in the foundation of the case, cracks that began in the investigation itself. Ellis is a small community of about 3,000 people, and the Ellis Police Department reflects the size of the city. With only a handful of officers and limited resources, the Garner murder was the biggest challenge they had faced in years. Police Chief Boyd Norton, who was in charge of the investigation, had never led a homicide investigation before. In fact, during his 20-year career at Ellis, he had only worked on 3 murder cases, none of which were as complex as Garner's. This lack of experience began to show through a series of procedural and protocol failures. The crime scene was not properly secured in the critical first hours after the body was discovered. Officers and even family members were allowed access to the scene, potentially contaminating vital evidence. No proper steps were taken to protect possible footprints or fingerprints outside the house. During the autopsy, John Garner's skin was not adequately tested for gunpowder residue, which could have determined whether he had been involved in a struggle with his attacker. Failure to collect this information was a critical omission, especially in a case where the attacker was believed to have approached the victim at close range. But the most serious error involved the gun found in Sandra's car. Although the gun was ballistically confirmed as the murder weapon, investigators failed to check the fingerprints on the door handle where they had to open it to find the weapon. Determining who touched that door handle could have provided an important clue as to who placed the gun in the car. This was a significant omission, especially since Sandra insisted that she did not place the gun there and did not know it was in her car. Judge Andrew Collins, who would later preside over the trial, did not hide his disappointment when he discovered the error. He noted that it was not simply a minor error, but a major flaw in the investigation that could seriously affect the credibility of the evidence the prosecution was relying on. As defense attorneys began preparing their case, they quickly identified the holes in the case. In particular, they point out that the police appear to have overlooked other potential suspects, focusing almost entirely on Sandra from the start. Among those who might have had the motive or opportunity to kill John Garner, one name stands out: Wesley Miller, Sandra's son from a previous marriage. Wesley, then 26, had a history of drug abuse and mental health issues. He had a strained relationship with his stepfather John, which erupted into frequent arguments and sometimes even physical confrontations. More importantly, just months before the murder, John had made a controversial decision to cut off Wesley's financial support, forcing him to fend for himself for the first time in his adult life. A neighbor, Eliza Thompson, told investigators that she saw a car similar to Wesley's near the Garner home on the night John was killed, but this lead was not fully investigated, and Wesley was never questioned in detail about his whereabouts on the night of the murder. James Carroll, the defense attorney assigned to Sandra, made no secret of his outrage over this. He argued strongly that the police had chosen their target too early, deciding that Sandra was the culprit before fully considering all possibilities. Once they were fixated on the wife murder theory, they stopped seriously investigating any other alternatives, leading to a one-sided and flawed investigation. While in Ellis County Jail awaiting trial, Sandra repeatedly maintained her innocence. In conversations with her attorney, she put forward a surprising theory. She believed that Wesley, her own son, could have killed John or hired someone to do it, then planted the evidence against her. According to Sandra, Wesley knew the password to her tablet and could easily have conducted internet searches to make her look guilty. He also had keys to her house and car, allowing him access to plant the murder weapon. While it may seem hard to believe that a mother would accuse her son of such a serious crime, those who knew Sandra and Wesley say their relationship was always complicated and at times hostile. Sandra admitted that she loved her son, but was also candid about his issues, including his intense hatred of John and the pleasure he could take from seeing his mother blamed for a crime he had committed. As the months passed and the trial approached, a complex picture began to emerge, one of a broken family, fractured relationships, and the unsettling possibility that justice could be bent in unforeseen ways. Amid conflicting evidence and competing theories, the truth about what happened the night John Garner was killed seemed increasingly elusive. After 21 long months of waiting in county jail, Sandra Garner finally faced trial in September 2019. The trial, held at the Ellis County Courthouse in Waxahachie, Texas, attracted significant local and even national media attention. Reporters crowded the courtroom each day, documenting every detail of a case that became the talk of Texas and beyond. The courtroom was a solemn space with rows of hard wooden benches and natural light filtering through tall windows. In the front, Sandra Garner sat next to her defense attorney, wearing a simple light gray suit, no makeup, and her hair tied back. No longer the confident woman who had run a happy household, Sandra looked gaunt and visibly aged after nearly 2 years in prison, her face gaunt with new lines of worry around her eyes and mouth. Prosecutor Doug Lockard, a short man with cropped hair and piercing eyes, opened the proceedings with a steely argument. This case, he argued, was not a complicated mystery, but a straightforward tale of greed, deception, and a woman who carefully planned to kill her husband for $2.5 million in life insurance. Lockard methodically outlined the key pieces of evidence: the gun found in Sandra's car, the suspicious internet searches, and the inconsistencies in her story. He also presented testimony from John's co-workers, who described him as unhappy in his marriage and considering divorce in the months before his death. According to Lockard, John Garner had unwittingly signed his own death warrant when he purchased that life insurance policy. To Sandra, her husband was worth more in death than he was alive, a statement that sent shivers down the spine of many in the courtroom. But defense attorney James Carroll painted a very different different picture. Tall and thin with silver hair and a deep voice, Carol portrayed an innocent woman caught in a legal nightmare, victim not only of the loss of her beloved husband, but also of a botched and misdirected investigation. In his opening, Carol not only attacks the shortcomings of the police investigation, but also offers a shocking alternative explanation. Wesley Miller, Sandra's son, is the real killer, or at least the one who orchestrated the murder and blamed his mother. Carol points out that the police never took Wesley seriously, despite his strong motives, a deep hatred for the man who had cut him off financially and interfered with his relationship with his mother. Wesley had easy access to his mother's home and her electronic devices, allowing him to conduct questionable internet searches and plant a gun in her car. Notably, Wesley had no solid alibi for the night of the murder, and at least one witness confirmed seeing his car in the area. As witnesses took the stand, the shortcomings of the police investigation became increasingly apparent, even to casual observers. Chief Norton admitted that his department had little experience investigating homicides and had made several mistakes in processing the crime scene. He also reluctantly admitted that several standard procedures had not been followed, including failing to take fingerprints from the door handle where the gun was found. A fingerprint expert who testified stated that the failure to check the door handle for fingerprints was an unconscionable omission in such an important investigation. Determining who touched that handle could be crucial in determining who placed the murder weapon in the car. As the trial progressed, questions about Wesley Miller became increasingly persistent. A neighbor testified that she had seen a car matching Wesley's description parked near the Garner home on the night of the murder. A former co-worker testified that John had expressed serious concerns about Wesley's increasingly erratic behavior, including several physical threats. But perhaps the most important moment of the trial came when Sandra Garner took the stand herself, a risky move that many defendants in murder cases tend to avoid. Dressed in casual clothes and speaking softly but firmly, she told her version of what happened that fateful night. With tears streaming down her face, Sandra affirmed her love for John, describing him as the pillar of her life. She strongly denied killing her husband, arguing that she could never hurt the man she loved so deeply. Sandra explained that the internet searches found on her device must have been made by someone else, most likely Wesley, when she was not home or using her tablet. As for the gun, she insisted she had no idea it was in her car and had no idea how it got there. Prosecutor Lockhart questioned Sandra harshly, pointing out the many inconsistencies in her story and her inability to explain key details. She could not say why no one heard a noise when the intruder supposedly entered the house, or why there were no signs of forced entry. She also could not provide a satisfactory explanation for why the intruder would spare her after killing her husband, or how he knew the exact amount of money stored in the safe. Sandra, however, stood her ground, unwavering in her assertion of innocence, even under the pressure of hours of questioning. The courtroom spectators were divided into two camps: those who believed they were witnessing the performance of a skilled killer wife, and those who believed they were witnessing the genuine pain of an innocent woman wrongly accused. As the trial reached its final stages, both sides made compelling arguments. Prosecutor Lockhart urged the jury to focus on the core evidence: the murder weapon in Sandra's car, her internet searches, and her apparent financial motive. Attorney Carroll highlighted the shortcomings of the investigation and the strong possibility that Wesley Miller was the real killer, or at least the one who had set up the crime to frame his mother. After 3 days of tense deliberation, the jury returned with an unexpected verdict: not guilty. As the judge read the verdict, the courtroom fell into stunned silence before a ripple of whispers spread. Sandra Garner, still standing at the lectern, broke down in tears, her shoulders shaking with uncontrollable sobs, showing her emotions completely unchecked for the first time since the trial began. After 21 months in prison, after nearly 2 years of being blamed for her husband's death, she was finally free. But for John Garner's family, the verdict was not the end of justice, but a terrible betrayal. Robert Garner, John's brother, could not contain his anger and pain as he stood before a crowd of reporters outside the courthouse. His voice shaking with emotion, he declared that justice had not been done that day. In his and his family's minds, Sandra had killed his brother, and now she had been cleared of wrongdoing thanks to shortcomings in the investigation and a clever story about a troubled son. Chief Norton also expressed disappointment, but with more sobriety, admitting that shortcomings in the police department's investigation played a role in the verdict. "We still believe we caught the right guy," he said, a look of weariness on his face. "But I have to accept that we did not give the jury an unassailable case. Perhaps we could have handled it better." Notably, Wesley Miller was not in the courtroom when his mother was acquitted. In fact, he was absent from the entire trial, although his name and actions were mentioned several times. Rumors circulated that he had left Texas altogether shortly after his mother's arrest, moving to another state and cutting off contact with most of his family and friends. As Sandra Garner left the Ellis County Jail with a small bag of personal belongings, a question hung in the air in Ellis, Texas. If Sandra did not kill John Garner, then who did? And if she did pull the trigger, was justice ever served? In the months following the trial, Sandra Garner made a decision that surprised many. She returned to live in the very house where her husband was killed. Many in the Ellis community saw this as a sign of innocence, that a woman who had murdered her husband could hardly live peacefully in the space that had witnessed her crime. Others saw it as a sign of a cold heart, one who could return to the scene of a brutal act without remorse. How Sandra has lived her life since her release has also raised question. She has kept a relatively low profile, rarely appearing in public and refusing all interview requests. She appears to have lost contact with Wesley, whose relationship broke down completely after she publicly suggested that he might have been the killer or had orchestrated the murder. She has also lost touch with John's family, who continue to believe that she was responsible for his death. For their part, the Garner family has not given up on their quest for justice. They have hired private investigators to continue investigating the case, hoping to find new evidence that could lead to a retrial. They have also lobbied to change the law on re-prosecutions in cases where new evidence is available, although their efforts have so far been unsuccessful. Meanwhile, the public remains divided on Sandra Garner's story. The case has been the subject of countless articles, podcasts, and even a documentary, with advocates on both sides vigorously arguing for her guilt or innocence. Many find her story credible, pointing out that a woman as intelligent as Sandra would not have left such obvious traces if she had planned to kill her husband. Others argue that the evidence against her was too overwhelming to ignore, and that the not guilty verdict reflects the shortcomings of the justice system rather than the reality of what happened. Perhaps the most troubling thing about the Sandra Garner case is that it represents an all too common scenario in the American justice system. Cases where the truth is never truly known, where justice depends more on the quality of the investigation and the ability of the lawyers than on the objective reality of what happened. It reminds us that justice, in its truest sense, is often a fragile and subjective concept, easily bent and shaped by imperfect human hands. As the years have passed since the murder of John Garner and Sandra's trial, the case remains a controversial and contemplative subject in Ellis, Texas, and beyond. It has left a lasting mark, not only on those directly involved, but also on the law enforcement community and the criminal justice system as a whole. For the Ellis Police Department, the case was a painful wake-up call about the importance of thorough, professional investigation. Following the trial, the department made significant changes to its procedures, particularly those related to protecting crime scenes and collecting evidence. They also hired additional personnel specially trained in forensic science and modern investigative techniques. Chief Norton, who faced widespread criticism for his handling of the case, retired a year after the trial, ending a 20-year career in the shadow of a botched case. His successor, Chief Maria Rodriguez, has prioritized professional training for all officers and established closer ties with state law enforcement agencies that can provide expert assistance in complex cases. In legal circles, the Garner case is often cited as a prime example of how investigative flaws can jeopardize a prosecution, even in cases where the circumstantial evidence seems overwhelming. It has become a case study at area law schools, where professors use it to emphasize the importance of carefully examining evidence and considering alternative theories. Douglas Lockard, the lead prosecutor in the Garner case, spoke about the experience in a rare interview 2 years after the trial. Still looking pained, he admitted that the case changed the way he approached his work. He realized that a strong case is not just about having good evidence, but also about how that evidence was gathered and whether the investigation can withstand scrutiny. For defense attorney James Carroll, the Garner case represented a notable victory in a career that has spanned more than 3 decades. But he also admitted that the verdict left him with a sense of incomplete satisfaction. If Sandra was truly innocent, as he argued, it meant that John Garner's killer was still out there, unpunished. And if Wesley was indeed involved, as he suggested throughout the trial, Carroll had unwittingly contributed to allowing another killer to escape justice. Perhaps most distressing is the impact the case has had on the small community of Ellis. The town, known for its close-knit spirit and mutual trust, is now divided, with tensions between those who believe Sandra is innocent and those who believe she got away with a terrible crime. Many local stores have posted signs in support of the Garner family, while others have welcomed Sandra back with open arms. Some residents have even moved away, unable to bear the constant conflict that has become a part of everyday life in Ellis. When casual visitors pass by the small town, they may not notice the open wounds from the Garner case. But for those who live there, those wounds are still very real and very deep. Every time they pass by the house where Sandra continues to live, they can't help but wonder, what really happened that fateful night, and will the truth ever come out? 5 years after the verdict, the Sandra Garner case remains one of the most controversial criminal cases in modern Texas history. The story has been retold countless times, analyzed on reality crime shows, and become the subject of numerous books and podcasts. Each retelling has spawned new theories and speculation, but rarely offers a satisfying conclusion. For her part, Sandra Garner has chosen a relatively reclusive life. Although she still lives in the house where her husband was killed, she rarely appears in public and refuses all interview requests. Neighbors sometimes see her at the grocery store or at her local church, but she usually keeps her head down and avoids eye contact. With her life insurance policy, which was eventually released after her acquittal, she is financially well off, although almost no one knows how she spends her money. Wesley Miller, who was publicly suspected during the trial, has all but disappeared from the radar. According to reliable sources, he has changed his name and moved to a West Coast state, cutting off all ties to his Texas past. His relationship with his mother, if it even exists, remains a mystery, although those close to the family say the rift between them appears irreparable. John's brother, Robert Garner, has remained steadfast in his quest for justice for his brother. He founded a nonprofit called Justice for John, which focuses on supporting investigations into unsolved murders and advocating for reforms in the criminal justice system. Every year on the anniversary of John's death, he holds a memorial service at the cemetery where his brother is laid to rest, inviting the community to never forget and never give up on the search for the truth. "I will never stop seeking justice for John," Robert shared in a recent interview. "There are nights when I lie awake thinking about how my brother died, and the person I believe killed him is still free. But I have to keep going, not just for John, but for all the others who have been let down by the system." For Sandra Garner, innocent or guilty, the experience has left indelible scars. The few people who have spoken to her in recent years describe a woman haunted by her past, unable to escape the shadow of suspicion that hangs over her. Although she was cleared legally, in the minds of many, she was found guilty. And that is perhaps a harsher sentence than any court could have handed down. For the Ellis Police Department, the Garner case has become a bitter but necessary lesson. According to Chief Rodriguez, every new officer is taught the case as an example of the importance of following proper investigative procedures. "We never want to make those mistakes again," she said. "Every victim deserves a thorough and professional investigation, and every suspect deserves a fair trial based on solid evidence." In the world of criminal justice, the Garner case illustrates an uncomfortable reality. Sometimes, the truth may not be known at all. While the system is designed to uncover truth and deliver justice, it is also susceptible to human error, bias, and procedural flaws. And when these factors combine, the result can be a story with no clear ending, a mystery that remains intact even after a verdict has been reached. In Sandra Garner's case, the jury decided that the evidence was insufficient to convict her. But a verdict of not guilty does not necessarily mean innocent. It simply means that the state failed to prove her guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. And in the space between not guilty and innocent lies a gray area where the truth may still be hidden. Criminal justice system experts point out that the Garner case is not unique in this regard. Every year, thousands of criminal cases end with similarly ambiguous conclusions, leaving victims without real closure, defendants with a permanent cloud of doubt hanging over their heads, and communities with uncomfortable questions about whether justice was actually served. "Our system is not perfect," explains Dr. Eleanor Wilkins, a criminal justice professor at the University of Texas. "It was designed to protect the innocent rather than to ensure that everyone who is guilty is punished. And that's a trade-off that we, as a society, have decided to accept." But in cases like Garner's, where there are so many unanswered questions, it can leave people dissatisfied on both sides of the equation. For John Garner, a man whose promising life and career were cut short too soon, the question of justice is not just theoretical but deeply personal. He was brutally murdered in his own home, a place that should have been his safest spot. And to this day, no one has been held accountable for his death in the eyes of the law. "That's what keeps me up at night," Robert Garner shares. "It's not just who did it, it's that they got away with it. They took my brother away and still don't pay for it." 7 years after John Garner's death and 5 years after Sandra Garner was acquitted, the case continues to haunt those involved and fascinate the public. It has been the subject of 2 books, a popular podcast series, and an upcoming Netflix documentary, all of which attempt to shed light on what really happened on the night of January 2nd, 2018. In Ellis, Texas, the case remains an open wound, a subject of contention that the people of this small town have learned to live with, but have never fully reconciled. The Garner home, where Sandra still lives, has become a kind of crime voyeurism hotspot, with strangers occasionally driving slowly to see the house where John Garner met his tragic end. For the Ellis Police Department, the Garner case remains an open case. Under Texas law, there is no statute of limitations for murder, and although Sandra Garner cannot be retried for her husband's murder, thanks to the principle of not being tried twice for the same crime, other suspects could theoretically be prosecuted if new evidence emerges. As night falls in Ellis, Texas, and the lights in the house where John Garner took his last breath flicker in the darkness, questions remain unanswered, and perhaps never answered. Who killed John Garner? Was justice really served? And in a system designed on the principle of not guilty until proven guilty, how can we ensure that the truth, but in continuing to raise them and not forgetting cases like Garner, we demonstrate our shared commitment to a concept of justice that extends beyond the confines of the courtroom, one based on truth, accountability, and compassion for all those affected by crime. And while our systems may not be perfect, and the truth may sometimes remain hidden, it is in the relentless pursuit of these ideals that we ultimately find meaning and purpose from tragedies like Sandra Garner's. Not in the final outcome, but in a final outcome. The journey toward justice.